I'm Christine Lee with Torrance City Cable, and today I'm giving you a virtual tour of the Torrance Art Museum's Gallery 1. Joining me is curator Hossain Hashemzadeh. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we're in a very unique situation because there is an exhibit in here that no one really can appreciate in person right now, right, Josh?
That is true, yeah. Unfortunately, we're keeping our fingers crossed for the end of August, but right now this is the most in-depth look I think that we can have.
So we thought we could bring the exhibit to you, and Josh and I are keeping our 6 feet distance, but you're going to show me around to each of these pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go through and hopefully learn some more about the exhibition.
All right, let's get started. Right behind us is the first one that you want to show us, right?
Yeah, so Roy Thurston, so this is an artist that was coming to prominence in like the late 70s and going through the 90s, and so he's using actually like metal works that he fabricates in his studio, and this piece specifically is using silicone that's going over that, and the way that silicone is reflecting light really plays to how the light of this piece is displayed throughout the day. So Anna Sue Hoy, she's another LA artist, but she's looking at materials here. Again, you can see like the concrete and the ceramic cast. It plays to a long history of ceramics within Los Angeles, but these minimalist forms are also in reference to East Coast-based sculptor Richard Serra, who had done a list, like an essay that listed a bunch of verbs that talked about like how one approaches art making. And so for her, she's taking that and kind of thinking about, the actions behind sculpture, right? So this like engagement of producing work as almost like a lifestyle engagement that informs the work and allows us to see these things in more dynamic ways.
And when I was looking at this over here, I was starting to get a little hungry because, am I right? Is this frozen yogurt?
So it is based on frozen yogurt. The piece is actually done in marble. And so this piece by Alex Israel is called The Big Chill, which takes its name from a very prominent frozen yogurt establishment in LA, The Big Chill. And then it also plays to the movie, the 80s movie as well, The Big Chill. And so it's kind of this play on history within LA and also this idea of fiction kind of permeating the ways we live our lives.
And then you're going from colors to like white again. What's this?
So Lauren Halsey, she's working with, again, really sort of basic industrial materials in order to tell like local stories that maybe otherwise wouldn't exist in like, the concept of a museum or an institutional history. So working in South Central Los Angeles, she's taking these, almost like hieroglyphic-esque substrates, right, and like carving into them in the same way that pictographs or things like that have conveyed stories for thousands of years. So this is an artist that really is a master of illusion. So like all of these works, they look absolutely real, but when you start to look at them, and you can kind of see on the back of that piece there, they are just canvases, and they're basic materials that are meant to emulate these kind of industrial substrates. And so for him, like thinking about the relationship between Japan and America, having grown up and exposed to like Vietnam War, he's really thinking about like the way illusions kind of exist within a cityscape, and also like the idea of building something, I think in LA, that's so rooted in this kind of like development and sensationalism, that there's always this kind of like element of illusion to that as well, right? There's always like hopefulness of what something could be and the reality of what it actually is. And so I think like finding him kind of in the middle of those two things in a way that feels almost like still life or representative, but then also kind of like formal and abstract, I think is an interesting play.
And over here, am I seeing a bunch of ropes?
They are. So Claudia Parducci, she's working with bronze cast to create these ropes, and so she's also very invested in this kind of thinking of architecture, but sort of with like a feminist approach. So rethinking the way that a lot of these kind of archetypes of environment have been created predominantly from maybe like a male perspective, and kind of turning them on their head. So I always like looking at this piece almost like trophies, like an old log cabin has those hunting trophies, kind of up on the wall. Here she's posing the same thing, but in a way that's maybe alluding to a more malleable sense of what those things could be, and how like interpretation on that can kind of remove its meaning or kind of play with that meaning. So Math Bass is an LA-based sculptor and painter, but I always like this piece because the bright colors, for one, and the shape of this sculpture in itself kind of refers back to maybe some of the like local things that you would see. So maybe like when you see a storefront close, right? They pull that gate in front.
I was gonna say it
Yeah,
looks
you
like
kinda-
the bars that you have outside windows or outside doors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like it plays a little bit to that, but it also becomes this really kind of elegant and isolated form as well. And so kind of playing to how maybe someone interprets that imagery as something both maybe like banal, but then also beautiful, I think is an interesting contrast within this piece, and something that also kind of plays to that mid-century aesthetic that we talked about with Anna Sue Hoy and some of the other artists in the exhibition. So this is
That
kind
one
of
looks
like
totally different.
polar opposite, right? So it's like still very simplistic forms, but here kind of playing to a history of sculpture, like self-leaning. So it's kind of a sculpture that's working for itself. And I always like the fact that too the silhouette of this kind of is reminiscent of overalls. So kind of like thinking about labor and the idea of the history of sculpture as a sort of masculine endeavor, and then thinking about how that can maybe be, examined and deassembled and stuff. So thinking about this as a sculpture in relationship to that, you see how different these things are, but really like reducing things to their most iconic representation, right? How you can derive meaning from form in a very sort of basic and visceral way. So this is actually an interactive piece by Juan Capistran. And so you have the image of a person laying on the ground, which in today's climate is a very charged symbol, but he's left it pretty ambiguous, right? You don't know if that person's doing well, if they've just passed out, if they're just taking a moment to lay down. But I think it's really playing to like our familiarity of these images and like the meanings that we throw onto something. And so if you flip them over, there is a quote that says, "Empire does not confront us like subject facing us, but that of an environment that is hostile to us." So thinking of really like how we're affected by the sort of systemic totality of everything around us, and how we derive meaning from that, and whether it's inflicted on ourselves or others, it's something that's really sort of prominent now, and I think has been for a long time. And so he really plays to that as a local LA resident, bringing that history. So Helen Pashkin is a very prominent LA artist that really rose to acclaim in the 1960s. So she's sort of a champion of the light and space movement, along with many others that you may know, Mary Corse, James Turrell, Robert Irwin. And so she's really playing with like translucent materials, and she's one of the early people to do this, and also really kind of set a paramount for female minimalists within Los Angeles. And so all of her pieces, there's kind of like this hidden element to it. And as you said, as you move around that piece, it kind of reveals things, and the more time you spend with it, or the more light is refracted through the objects, you start to find things kind of hidden within, and it creates this kind of abstract experience that is really dynamic to the way light plays with an object. And I think in California, there's no place better to play with natural light than here. So Aaron Sandnes, he is a younger painter as well. He's based here, working with this piece with car enamel and paint. So this is actually based on the manufactured paint of a Pontiac. So thinking again of this kind of like local, almost like hot rod culture and this kind of Americana presence. And then you'll get these 4 triangles on each one of these X paintings that create that dynamic sort of glossy X in the middle. And so those shapes, although they look just kind of geometric, and they are, they kind of reference, or they're meant to reference, the folding of an American flag at ceremonies. And so he had lost a friend in the Iraq War. And so this is kind of paying tribute to that in a way that says, like, we pay respect to that, but there's also this fascination of like, this Americana will to like just kind of keep going forward, kind of like, pedal the metal kind of thing, like within hot rod culture, that is both enticing but also detrimental. And I think navigating why we lie somewhere in the middle of that is something that's interesting to him, and something that these paintings continue to contemplate.
Now we go from a bold color to a more kind of
Yeah,
muted.
so Lynn Aldrich, she's working in LA for some time as well. Also really invested in, readily available materials. So you'll recognize that all of these are rain gutters, that you see on any suburban home. But they're painted and dissected and cut and fabricated in ways that create a really kind of organic shape. And this amalgamation of these materials, although kind of simple in their construction, one, start to develop a real complexity, and I think two, they kind of become a metaphor for LA's housing development too in some ways, right? It's like this kind of organized and uniform development that kind of becomes chaotic in some ways, and in some ways kind of beautiful, but otherwise, problematic. And so I think playing with that, these objects, which again are really simple, can start to have real meaning and tell stories about a place that's unique and different from the way people may have approached sculpture on the East Coast and stuff at that time. So really kind of playing to a local environment here.
So these are rain gutters.
They are rain gutters, yeah. It's you can make art with simple materials and generate I think great meaning out of that. So this is a piece by Sam Durant. So these are all taken off of like historical photos and documentations of protest posters. So taking something that's really existing, one in the streets and engaged in a sort of civil rights discourse. He's presenting them as these larger than life light boxes that are reminiscent of the billboards and neon signs that you find on any boulevard or avenue here in LA. But really thinking about how these ideas of protest, these messages of civil rights can kind of be reinterpreted over time, and how there's a kind of fluidity to the messages, and then also the presence that they have, and even the word you're on Indian land, like now today, is maybe looked at differently than it was then, and so the way that language changes, I think he's advocating that civil rights kind of needs to make that kind of progression as well, and that these things are always adapting, and it's not a static environment. So Laddie Dill, this is a piece from the late 60s, and he's worked with neon early on to create almost like these sentences out of light, and for him, like creating this meaning either vertically or horizontally out of these materials that again relate to that light and space movement, were really like pivotal to his practice, and again helped shape the LA art scene in a way that was reflective of that environment. So all those neon signs that you see when you're looking for takeout and stuff, you're so exposed to them that they become synonymous in the way we think about how do you depict a city like Los Angeles or city in general. And I think Laddie Dill using that as a fine art object or material was really an interesting approach at that time, and still is relevant today.
Well, thank you so much, Josh, for showing me
Yeah,
around.
thank you.
And thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.